Barron Trump was the talk of the town, with many claiming the kid has it in him to perhaps be president himself one day.
Everyone thought Barron Trump was just another spoiled rich kid, until he completely embarrassed a top banker in front of a powerful crowd. The woman laughed, mocking Barron's business skills, expecting everyone to join in. But Barron was ready. With a calm yet razor-sharp response, he turned the entire room against the arrogant banker, leaving her speechless. How could someone so young take down a woman who had ruled Wall Street for years? Tune in, because what happened next shook the entire financial world so hard, the fear of another Great Depression was imminent. The night a banker's confidence shattered. This wasn't just another high-end gathering, it was a battlefield of power, a place where reputations were tested and egos clashed. In the midst of it all sat Barron Trump, unfazed, detached, and completely uninterested in the artificial grandeur around him. He wasn't there to impress, didn't need to prove anything. But someone else in that room had different plans. A certain banker, brimming with arrogance, saw an easy target and decided to take a shot. She had no idea what she was walking into. Before we dive into this, one thing is certain. What happened next didn't just change the conversation, it shattered every assumption about Barron Trump, and this won't be the only moment that will leave you stunned. At first, it was just light jabs, subtle comments laced with fake politeness. A sneer here, a knowing glance there, all leading to a bigger performance. Encouraged by the low murmurs of approval around her, she pushed further. The insults became sharper, the ridicule more direct. She thought she had control, thought she had the room wrapped around her little finger. Confidence, when mixed with ignorance, is a dangerous thing, and that's exactly what was about to destroy her. But something shifted. It wasn't immediate, just a slow, creeping change in the air. Laughter faded, replaced by uncertain glances. The unease spread like a ripple, infecting even those who had been entertained a moment ago. And then Barron spoke. No theatrics, no raised voice, just a few words, precise and devastating. And just like that, the mood flipped. The laughter was gone. The audience, once eager to play along, now realized they were watching something else entirely. The banker's face froze. This was not the reaction she had expected. She had been so sure that Barron would fold, that he'd stumble, that she'd walk away the clear winner. Instead, she stood there exposed, unraveling under the weight of her own miscalculation. He wasn't playing the game she had planned. He wasn't flustered or defensive. He was just composed. And that, more than anything, was what turned the crowd against her. She searched for a way out, but it was too late. The moment had already slipped through her fingers. The room wasn't on her side anymore. The same people who had laughed moments ago now avoided her gaze, shifting in their seats, distancing themselves from the mess unfolding before them. Barron didn't need to gloat. He didn't have to. His silence did the job for him. And then someone in the crowd muttered something that sealed her fate. It was a simple truth, one that cut through the last of her pride. She had just mocked the son of one of the most powerful men in the world. And everyone knew exactly what that meant. Her stomach dropped. She had built her entire career on confidence, sharp words, and an unshakable belief in her own wit. But now she stood on the edge of a steep fall with no way to climb back up. The host of the event, who had remained silent until now, finally stepped in. His expression was unreadable, his tone measured, but his decision was final. There would be no debate, no second chance. This wasn't just a slip-up, it was an unforgivable error. It happened quickly. The words spoken to her weren't loud, weren't aggressive, but they carried a weight that made her chest tighten. A hand on her shoulder, a quiet instruction, and suddenly she was being led away. Past the people who had cheered her on moments before, past the same faces now too afraid to meet her eyes. The cold night air hit her like a slap. But nothing was as cold as the realization sinking in. Her time here was over. No way back, no fixing it. She had spent years crafting an image, climbing the social ladder, making sure she was seen and heard. But now it had all crumbled in a matter of minutes. Inside, life continued as if she had never been there. Conversations restarted, drinks flowed, and business deals resumed. Those who had once considered her an equal now looked right through her, pretending she no longer existed. Some turned their backs completely, eager to distance themselves from her mistake. She had been part of their world, but now she was nothing more than a footnote, a warning, a reminder of what happens when arrogance blinds you to reality. The guest had moved on. The show was over, and she was no longer relevant. And Barron, he remained as unbothered as ever. No smirk, no satisfaction, not even acknowledgement. He simply carried on with his evening as if none of it had mattered. And that, more than anything, was the most brutal part of it all. If he had laughed, if he had shown any emotion at all, she might have salvaged a sliver of dignity. But he didn't. He had dismissed her entirely, erased her with his indifference. And that, above all, was what made her defeat absolute. She had miscalculated everything. She thought she was dealing with just another rich kid, a name with no substance, an easy target. But respect isn't something you take, it's something you earn. And when you lose it, there's no getting it back. She had crossed a line she didn't even realize existed, and now she had to live with the fallout. You never really know who you're trying to belittle. Sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the most power. And by the time she realized it, it was already too late and the consequences had just begun. The impossible equation challenge. The classroom felt like a battlefield, everyone waiting for the first strike. Dr. Markham's glare was sharp as she took slow, deliberate steps toward the whiteboard, marker in hand. "All right, Mr. Trump," she said, voice dripping with challenge. "Since you have such strong opinions about mathematics, let's put that confidence to the test." The marker screeched against the board as she wrote, numbers and symbols piling up in a monstrous equation that stretched across the surface. A few students exchanged nervous glances, some even whispering. This wasn't just difficult, this was the kind of problem that sent even seasoned mathematicians into a cold sweat. She turned, smirking as she tapped the marker against the board. "Go ahead," she said, arms crossed. "Show us how it's done. Unless, of course, you'd rather sit down and keep talking about things you don't understand." The words stung, and the challenge was clear: humiliation or victory. The class held its breath, waiting for the inevitable embarrassment. But Barron didn't flinch. He stood up, calm as ever, and walked toward the board. His expression was unreadable, his movements steady. Dr. Markham's smirk widened. This was going to be good. She had deliberately chosen this problem, knowing full well that it required methods far beyond anything taught in the course. There was no way he could pull this off. Then Barron spoke, his voice even and controlled. "Before I begin, I'd like to point out that this problem has more than one approach. Would you prefer I use the standard method or a more efficient solution based on original work by Leibniz?" The room fell silent. Even she hesitated for a moment. "You've read Leibniz's original work?" she asked, the confidence in her voice faltering slightly. "Yes, in the original German. The translations lose some of the finer details." Barron didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The message was clear. This wasn't a bluff. He knew exactly what he was doing. He turned back to the board and without hesitation began to write. His movements were precise, his steps deliberate. The problem that had looked insurmountable moments ago now seemed to unravel under his pen. It wasn't just that he was solving it, he was explaining every step as he went, making it look almost effortless. The class watched in stunned silence, phones slowly being raised to record what was quickly becoming something more than just a math lesson. This first step, Barron continued, was first introduced by Euler in the 1700s. It simplifies what appears to be a complicated integral into something much more manageable. His hand moved across the board, the solution unfolding like a perfectly orchestrated plan. Even students who had struggled with basic calculus before found themselves following along. Dr. Markham, arms still crossed, leaned slightly forward, her eyes darting between the board and Barron's face. She was trying to find a flaw, some mistake she could call out, but none appeared. Barron wasn't just solving the problem, he was teaching it in a way that made more sense than any lecture she had ever given. "Now," he said, nearing the final steps, "we have two ways to proceed. The traditional method would take up another full board, but there's a more elegant approach using a lesser-known principle from Leibniz's notes." He turned to face her. "Which would you prefer?" Her expression was unreadable, her earlier smugness completely gone. The class, still recording, waited for her response. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the silence. Could we see both? It was Sarah Chin, one of the quieter students, her voice hesitant but firm. This actually makes more sense than how it was explained in the textbook. Barron smiled, nodding. Of course. He turned back to the board and continued. She remained silent, watching as the student she had intended to embarrass took complete control of her classroom. The weight of the moment hung in the air. This wasn't just about solving an equation, it was about proving a point. By the time Barron finished, the entire board was filled, but his work was as clear and clean as a textbook example. He set the marker down and turned back to the class. And that, he said simply, is how it's done. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then slowly, a few students began to clap. It wasn't loud at first, but it grew. The energy in the room shifted. Phones were still raised, capturing every moment. The classroom debate had already changed everything, but when Dean Richardson walked in, things took an even bigger turn. A professor's authority put to the test. The classroom door burst open with a loud bang, and in stormed Dean Richardson, a close supporter of her political stances. He barely took a breath before announcing, "Linda, we need you for an emergency faculty meeting. It's about the curriculum changes." The timing was absolutely terrible, or perhaps perfect depending on how one looked at it. She turned to her students, attempting to wrap up the session. "We'll continue this demonstration another time," she said, trying to maintain authority, but before she could take a step, Barron spoke up. "Professor, you gave me a public challenge. You asked me to solve this in front of everyone," Barron said, his voice steady but firm. His words sent a wave of murmurs through the class, and even the dean hesitated. Leaving now wouldn't set the right example about academic integrity, would it? Silence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. Dean Richardson's expression darkened, his mouth tightening as if preparing for a scolding. "Young man, are you implying—" "I'm not implying anything, sir," Barron cut in, polite but unwavering. "I'm simply stating that Dr. Markham wanted to make a point about privilege and merit, and I accepted the challenge. The only question is, will she follow through?" The weight of the moment was undeniable. Some students had their phones out, capturing what was clearly turning into something bigger than a classroom debate. She glanced at the marker in her hand, then at the equation on the board, the same problem she had picked to supposedly expose a lack of ability. But now it was her own competence under the microscope. The dean, who had arrived as an authority figure, now found himself just another spectator. The tension grew unbearable. Barron, in a move that left everyone breathless, held the marker out to Dr. Markham. "Or perhaps," he said, a quiet challenge in his tone, "you'd prefer to solve it first. After all, you've made it clear that knowledge is what really matters. As our professor, surely you can walk us through the solution?" The classroom fell into a stunned silence. Her fingers tightened around the marker as if it had suddenly turned to lead. Her mind raced. How had this happened? How had the moment she designed to humiliate one student flipped into an interrogation of her own knowledge? The presence of the dean wasn't a shield anymore. It was a witness, a judge. Phones stayed lifted, capturing every moment. She started, then faltered. Her eyes darted to the board. The equation wasn't impossible, but under this kind of scrutiny, every second felt like a lifetime. Barron, unshaken, extended an olive branch. "We could solve it together. Collaboration often leads to better understanding." There was no mockery in his tone, no arrogance, just a genuine offer. But that made it even worse. Dr. Markham's pride wouldn't allow her to take it. Her jaw clenched. "This is absurd," she snapped, tossing the marker onto the desk. "This entire stunt is nothing but a privileged student trying to undermine my authority." The class collectively exhaled, but the moment of tension didn't dissolve. It shifted. Now it was Barron's turn to pick up the pieces, or rather the marker. He bent down, retrieved it, and met Dr. Markham's fiery gaze with cool determination. "No," he said, voice unwavering, "this is about moving forward." And then, without another word, he turned to the board and did something that would leave the room breathless. In less than 5 minutes, he completed both solutions, the traditional method and an alternative approach. His movements were quick, precise, and completely unshaken. As he wrote the final number, the class exploded into applause. Even the dean couldn't hide his astonishment. But this wasn't the moment that would change everything. That came next. Dr. Markham stood there, her face drained of color, her carefully built reputation starting to crumble. Barron wasn't finished, though. He stepped back, facing both his professor and the dean. Mathematics doesn't care about politics, backgrounds, or biases, he stated, gesturing at the board. It only cares about truth. And when we let personal agendas cloud our judgment, we miss the opportunity to grow. The dean cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Mr. Trump, while your mathematical abilities are impressive, you must understand that... Before he could finish, a voice rang from the back of the room. That what? It was Michael Chin, a quiet scholarship student who rarely spoke. That we should learn less math because of someone's political beliefs? The words cut through the air like a blade. And just like that, the classroom, the faculty, and the institution itself were forced to face a new reality. One where knowledge, not authority, would decide who held the real power. What started as a classroom argument didn't stay in the room for long. Soon, more people heard about it, and the whole school was watching. One lesson that redefined the classroom. Dr. Markham's class was supposed to be about calculus, but instead it had turned into something else entirely. Students were getting frustrated. One stood up and said they came here to learn math, not to get a lecture about privilege. Others nodded, their patience running out. The air in the room was thick with tension, and for a moment it seemed like Dr. Markham was losing control of the class. Then a student did something unexpected. He spoke up, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the noise. He acknowledged that Dr. Markham knew a lot about math, but maybe they should stick to that instead of these other discussions. He even offered to help other students outside of class, blending theory with real problem solving. It was a lifeline, a way for Dr. Markham to keep control without backing down completely. The room fell silent, waiting to see what she would do. Dr. Markham hesitated. Her whole approach had been about challenging privilege and making students think about more than just numbers. But now, faced with the reality of their frustration, she had to make a choice. Slowly, she admitted she had been wrong. She had spent too much time focusing on one issue and had ignored what she was actually there to teach. The shift was subtle, but it changed everything. For the first time, she really saw her students for who they were, not just who she assumed they were. Then came the real shock. Students outside the class had started gathering. Word had spread fast. People were watching the drama unfold in real time, posting videos and reactions online. Soon, a crowd formed outside, holding signs with phrases like "Teach math, not politics," and "Merit over bias." The situation was about to explode into something much bigger than just a classroom debate. But the student who had spoken up wasn't done yet. Instead of letting things spiral, he walked to the door and spoke to the crowd. If they were here to learn, they should come inside. And just like that, students poured in, filling every seat and standing along the walls. Dr. Markham watched, stunned. She had been struggling to keep students engaged, and now, thanks to him, the room was packed with eager learners. What happened next became legend. He took the marker and turned the class back to what it was supposed to be: math. For the next hour, students listened, asked questions, and actually learned something useful. It wasn't about privilege or politics anymore. It was about numbers, equations, and real-world applications. And for the first time in a long time, Dr. Markham felt like she was truly teaching. The story spread across campus like wildfire. People expected it to be about a professor getting humiliated, but instead it became something else. Enrollment in advanced calculus skyrocketed. Dr. Markham, humbled by the experience, changed her approach. She went back to focusing on what she loved, teaching math. The student who had spoken up, true to his word, led study sessions and helped others bridge the gap between theory and practice. Was this professor trying to teach math, or was she using her position to push an agenda? And did she ever expect Barron Trump to outshine her so easily? Tell us what you think, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.